Everybody, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today, and it's a real pleasure to see all of you here late in the semester. And we had a scintillating election in Russia, and we're still looking at the recounts to see, like exactly how the electoral votes are going to be allocated from Kamchatka. But I think we have an idea of what the answer to it is. And so, so I'm very pleased to have everybody out here for it. Right before we've got a great group of panelists here today. We've got an intimate crowd, so we can have a really nice discussion about this. But just right before, I just want to introduce Alex Cooley to tell you a little bit about the lecture series that we're part of right now.
Great, thanks Josh. So just very briefly, welcome. So my name is Alex Cooley, I direct Columbia University's Harriman Institute, and this is now the end of the second year of a joint public policy seminar series that Josh and I have been putting on with generous support from the Carnegie Corporation. And it's meant to sort of spotlight important issues that are out there that concern Russia. Not just politics, we did one on the World Cup, we've done some on media, various topics that are out there. And what we want to do is kind of bring an academic and several academics' perspectives onto these kinds of public policy issues and really try and forge and establish a network and community within New York that cares about Russia-related issues. So thanks again for being part of this. Many of you have been here since the beginning. And the good news is that we'll continue to do it next year. Yeah. And so we're excited about that. And we have one more event until the end of the year, but I just also wanted to thank all our speakers for being here. I know this is a super busy time of the year and that you all have other commitments, but you're like the cream of the crop in terms of like informed academic analysis and research. So we're really grateful that you took the time. So with that, I will enjoy the insights.
Okay. So thanks very much, Alex, and thanks again for coming out. And as Alex mentioned, we do have one more event in our New York City Russia Public Policy series of the year, which will be on May 9th. We will be hosting a debate between Professor Stephen Cohen of New York University and former Ambassador Michael McFaul, now current Stanford professor, who will be talking about the new Cold War, who's to blame. So one more event, mark that on your calendar. We'll get information out. You can start reserving seats soon. May 9th.
What time?
It will be 5 o'clock as well, but it's going to be in a slightly bigger venue up by Columbia, called Casa Italiana. But we'll have details about that. And I also do, while you're all here, I want to also promote that tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Graham Robertson, who is part of our panel here, is going to be doing a normally scheduled Jordan Center seminar on his research, and that'll be tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see many of you back here tomorrow for Graham's presentation at 3. So without further ado, what I want to do is turn it over to the panel. And the format is very simple. We're going to give each of our panelists about 15 minutes to speak. Alex and I will then ask them a few questions to sort of follow up, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. And they have been instructed simply to think about what's the future like for Russia now in the aftermath of the election, where we have sort of one piece of, maybe it wasn't the most suspenseful information, but information resolved as we've now head into Putin's last term, question mark. So we're going to start. We're going to start with the order they were listed in the program, which was we're going to go first with Professor Henry Hale, who's a professor of political science and international affairs and co-director of the program on new approaches to regional and research and security in Eurasia, or PONAR's Eurasia. And we were fortunate enough here to host at the Jordan Center a PONAR's conference earlier this year, so many of you had an opportunity to see PONAR's in action. His work has won 2 prizes from the American Political Science Association, and he was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship for research in Russia in 2007 to 2008. He's spent extensive time conducting field research in post-Soviet Eurasia, a really extensive time, and is currently working on identity, politics, and political systems change, and actually has a brand new issue of Post-Soviet Affairs on identity in Ukraine that just came out. I think it just came out today. Yeah, it just came out today. A great thing that he co-edited with Gwen Sassy and Olga Onik, which is now available, and he's done numerous incredible work and yeoman service for all of us in this field. And I'm going to turn it over to him to start.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for coming. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. I think, maybe I'll just kind of start out with the observation that a lot of people have made and then take things from there. And that observation, of course, is that with this election, Putin has won the honor of entering his constitutionally final term in office as things currently stand. And basically, I think what's interesting about that is not so much that he won, of course, as Josh said. But the fact that this does bring him into a period where at some point something is going to have to change, and we don't know exactly what that's going to be, but we can start to think about what some of the consequences of it might be. In general, succession periods, they're always trouble for authoritarian regimes, and they have been particularly troublesome even within Russia as well as the post-Soviet space. So we can think about what happened when Yeltsin was departing office. You basically had a massive rupture of the elite, a big coalition of the biggest oligarchs and most powerful regional machines, basically ganged up, teamed up with the former prime minister, and for a while, as of the summer of '99, were the favorites to win the election and to defeat the Kremlin. And it was only through this kind of crazy series of events of mysterious origin, we'll kind of leave it at that, where you have these apartment bombings, basically residential buildings explode, Putin sends the troops into Chechnya, kind of a rally around the leader effect ensues, and his popularity surges, and then kind of that opposition coalition falls apart. And he winds up winning a fairly easy presidential contest, but it was very, very difficult. I think maybe even an unexpected win from the perspective of early 1999, for sure, when hardly anybody knew who Putin was. In the former post-Soviet space, you've seen even more severe consequences from succession crises. I think that pretty much all the three main color revolutions can be linked to problems of succession. Putin has paid attention to at least some of those. And in 2011, 2012, which is another presidential succession election, and I do see links there, you saw the outbreak of some of the largest protests that Russia had seen in 2011, 2012, which occurred after Putin had handed the presidency off to Medvedev, announced he was coming back. A lot of people were unhappy with this. Then you had election fraud to kind of cover up that problem, and you had the outbreak of street protest, which kind of shook the regime for a while. I would say, however, that I think today's situation is a little closer to 2007, 2008 than it is to those other successions that I just mentioned, which kind of emphasize the big risks, in the sense that Putin now wields a great deal of popular support, which he did in 2007, 2008, and that support allowed him to manage the process. Polls were showing that pretty much whoever he endorsed would get a 20 to 40% bump in the polls. So even if you had had a fully competitive election at that time, his endorsement would have weighed pretty heavily and helped him control the process. Although even then you started to see kind of some of the tensions break out within the regime. Different clans of Siloviki and others were started arresting each other and publicizing compromise against each other, trying to shape the outcome. One theory is that there are a number of groups within the Kremlin that didn't want Putin to leave and were trying to convince him that he needed to stay in order to establish order. So the larger point is that this sort of period can be dangerous even within the context of a very tightly controlled political system like Russia's is today. And so Putin is going to have to deal with it sooner or later. And I actually think that the issue was probably likely to come somewhat to a head on the sooner side, a little sooner than one might expect. There's a sort of practice in this part of the world where parliamentary elections that precede presidential ones can be seen as tests of strength of different elite groups trying to test the waters for how much influence and power they have on the succession, trying to demonstrate their strength so they have to be reckoned with. And so because of a constitutional reform, basically the timing of the next parliamentary election is only in 3 years. It's basically, at least if it stays on schedule, in 2021, whereas Putin's term runs out in 2024. So it's still a ways, there's a separation there, but my guess is that that election is going to be seen and interpreted by people in the elite, especially as a test of strength of these different groups trying to emphasize it, including the Kremlin, right? Trying to prove that whoever Putin wants, or that the Kremlin itself, under Putin's control, can control the situation. But that, I hesitate to say the Kremlin because there are different groups within the Kremlin that might try to play some games here and might see some advantage to weakening or strengthening the result of the favored parties or candidates, or favoring the composition of the different people that make it into the dominant party, United Russia, if United Russia stays the main vehicle. I think a lot of people will be looking to Putin's cabinet choices. New cabinet choices are expected. now that he's nominated. I actually don't see these as likely to be too important. I think more likely he's likely to appoint people that'll kind of be in a holding pattern. Typically he's really kind of revealed his cards or revealed who his choice is only towards the end of the succession process, lest that designated successor start to kind of get too much authority, and then Putin becomes really a lame duck. So what I'll do is just in the remaining time focus on a couple main challenges that he faces in light of succession, just kind of put things out there for discussion. And so the first question is basically, what will he do to try and sustain the popularity that can help him guide the process and help him be an asset in steering the outcome in the way he wants, to avoid a sense of staleness, kind of fatigue with the regime that might lead to its breakdown in an uncontrollable way, basically in order to control the end game. And then the other question is kind of what will his end game be? What's his exit strategy? And so first of all, just focusing on public opinion. Of course, if he's lucky, the economy will be growing like gangbusters. There won't be any real issue for him there. Although even so, after a certain point, he's been in power so long that I don't think just economic growth is likely to do it for him. I think he's likely to have to find some new ways to freshen up the regime, to keep it seen as dynamic and somehow serving the people, or at least not disserving them so badly that there are incentives for people from within the Kremlin circles to break away and try to mobilize opposition. So he's already done a lot of things fairly successfully. So he's when running into the problems in 2011, 2012, he's tapped into conservative political values, things that like kind of anti-gay sentiment, things like that were sort of latent in the population, but hadn't really been politicized before. He's kind of mobilized that politically. But I think part of the problem there is, that's kind of been tapped now, but it's unclear that this is really a political cleavage that he can ride, especially because some of the other values that kind of go in that set, I don't think really actually work for his advantage. So if we take the kind of issues related to migration that have been shaking lots of regimes, I think he's actually quite weak on migration. So when you prime people about migration, support for him goes down, and support for more radical alternatives tends to go up. So I think that's one reason that he has, he has to tread cautiously. And plus, most of the migrants come from parts of the world that he wants to embrace, in a new kind of more integrated union. So that's intention. He doesn't want those kinds of tensions raised, and so he has to control those. So I don't think he can really push too far on conservative values. Certainly if you're talking about more kind of ethnic xenophobia, that poses too many problems for him, I think. And a lot of focus has been put now on the importance of rally around the flag, rally around the leader effects. He's clearly benefited from these. Crimea is the most potent example. You can see pretty much immediately after the annexation there, his public support went up by about 20% in the opinion polls. Syria seems to have worked in that same kind of direction. So it's hard now to tell, exactly where that bump in popularity is coming from. Has the effect of Crimea worn out? I've seen contradictory findings on that, because maybe the glow from Crimea has been replaced by, a glow from Syria, sort of, Russia expanding its military role in the world. But at a certain point, you start to run out of military options, or, I don't know, maybe you could sustain it kind of every other year, move into, I don't know, sort of eastern Kazakhstan or something with or the Baltics by instigating crises there. But on the other hand, this runs against, I think, a kind of a core, basic Russian preference for stability. Of course, there's also a possibility that he could mobilize anti-Westernism, but of course that's been a trope that he's been kind of trying to milk for a long time. I'm personally pretty skeptical that this is actually working for him. They were pushing anti-American themes very heavily in the fall of 2011, and it didn't save the United Russia Party from having a very weak performance. So I'm not sure that this actually is really what's driving it. I've seen, I don't want to come out too unequivocally there, but my sense is that that's not going to be a terribly promising option, but he may well continue to try it. The kind of counterintuitive possibility that I would mention would be the possibility of something different, right? Something that we might not expect, which could include, I think, a pro-Western turn. I would not predict that this is what he's going to do, but I think there's potential support for him to tap into. Certainly in the opinion polls, it comes out, I think, pretty clearly that he's supported for being a foreign policy moderate, not for being a foreign policy hawk. People who support the hawks, who want to treat the West and Russia and the United States as enemies, tend to support people like Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky. In Putin's own rhetoric, it's not kind of this raving lunacy that he's presenting to the Russian public. I mean, he's saying, well, look, these crazy Westerners, they're advancing on us. They're blaming us for killing a double agent when clearly they probably did it. Look, we're just being moderate. Look at this hostility coming at us. These are our partners, but they're just so unreliable. I'm doing the best we can. On one hand, the tensions allow him to kind of put himself in that role. But on the other hand, I think one reason that he does that is because there's a basic baseline support for positive relations with the West. So if you ask in opinion polls, as a lot of people do, is the West an enemy? Is the West treating Russia badly, or the United States? Yes, yes, yes. If you ask the policy question, how should Russia treat the West? The plurality or majority response has consistently been throughout the Putin era. If you give them a choice between treating the West as an enemy, a rival, a partner, or a friend, it's been for partnerly relations. Very few think friend. But there are a number of reasons like this that I just think that it's possible that a pro-Western turn could be something new and fresh that we should at least prepare for. A recent article by Tim Colton in the journal Daedalus finds, for example, that the peak when the most Russians kind of ever were thinking that the country was going in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction was in the tandem period, which was more Western oriented. Even Crimea, the peak of Crimea, didn't quite reach the peak of the tandem. Disillusionment with the tandem proceeded fairly rapidly, but in any case, I think we should at least consider this. And then I'll kind of wrap up by thinking just very briefly, maybe other people will talk about this in more detail, about what might be Putin's endgame. Of course, one possibility is to stay on in the presidency. I think kind of the removal of term limits in China maybe makes that marginally more likely. Scenarios abound for how this could be done, how the Constitution could be changed. But this was expected also in 2007, 2008, and he chose the kind of politically risky move of shuffling things up, which caused some problems in the regime, and ultimately decided to come back. So I'm not sure what he'll do, obviously, but he said or indicated that he's not going to leave office, and I think historically what he's said, when he said it fairly clearly, has been a pretty good guide to what he's going to do in similar such matters. So, of course, the problem with leaving in some way is that you can't trust your successors. So I would be thinking about looking for ways in which he might try to, if he doesn't just kind of do another tandem arrangement, as he did with Medvedev where he became prime minister, maybe going a bit further. One possibility would be just to create a parliamentary regime, maybe even removing direct presidential elections. He becomes that. But the other option, which if he actually wants to leave power, which I don't think we can rule out, he might want to just enjoy all the wealth and privilege that he's accumulated, might be somehow to deconcentrate power in Russia, doing something like Ivanishvili, the oligarch, did in Georgia, which was basically he left in place a very fragmented coalition of different networks that all supported him, and they all had different posts of authority, and so no one of them could dominate. But it was a situation in which Ivanishvili himself, from behind the scenes, could kind of reemerge as arbiter, whenever something seemed to get out of control. But he doesn't have to manage the day-to-day affairs of government. I would just kind of toss that situation out as one possibility. Of course, it runs against Putin's kind of ideology of a strong, centralized state. But by the same time, even if he changes the Constitution, he's getting older, health problems could emerge that forces him to deal with this anyway. And so, I would guess that he's probably at least considering some of these other types of options. So let me just leave it at that for now, and look forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Okay, thanks very much, Henry. Next up is going to be Professor Yoshiko Herrera, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Director of the UW-Madison Partnership with Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. Professor Herrera's work focuses on politics in Russia and Eurasia, social identities and norms, national and ethnic politics, and constructivist political economy, and though it's not in her Bio, near and dear to my heart. She actually wrote a book about state statistical organizations as well. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to have her here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Herrera. So, yeah, hit that one.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay. This may be unnecessary, but I thought I would be repeating everybody else's visual graphics, but maybe a few are useful. Okay, so I gotta look one way or the other. Okay, so what did we learn from the election? Oh, my images are not there. That's not good. Okay, how would that be?
It looks like you have to download them somehow. There's a little X in the corner there.
Oh, yeah, maybe there's some, maybe it's a virus protection?
Yeah.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
Oh,
can you
no,
right
it's not
click
there.
on that or this image.
Is it just that one, or is it all?
What if I just click this
Enlarge that maybe.
or this thing down here? Was that one? I have that.
If you go to that, it's going to be the same thing you just read a second ago.
Okay, well, we'll just forget about that for now.
We didn't learn
Okay.
a lot from the
All right.
election.
No new information. Okay, that's the first one. What did we learn from the
Blank slate.
elections? Nothing. Nothing. We still know the same things we knew about Putin, and we didn't really learn that much more from the electorate, in my opinion. There are a couple of differences. What? In fall 2011, with the parliamentary elections, we did learn something, because a lot of people voted for that fake party Fair Russia as a protest vote, and that was surprising, and that led to protests in December 2011. I think that was new, and that was interesting, and that led to a sort of mini crisis in 2012. But in this case, I think it was the same old kind of fraud, maybe a little bit different. They changed a few of the people in the Electoral Commission. But this time, I think one difference in the fraud data that's going to come out is that instead of just ballot stuffing in new and innovative ways, they also were very interested to manipulate turnout, which you can do by changing the denominator. So if you focus on the population and the population of voting age people and then the percent that voted, if you can just change the bottom number rather than the number of people that voted, it's another way to increase the turnout. And I think that's gonna, it's still speculative at this point, but I think that as data comes out and people start looking into the denominator of the number of Russian voters, they'll see that, as Navalny claims and others, that there's some hocus pocus going on there. So my main message of this talk that I want to share with you is that I think the election results in Western democracies, or in democracies, elections are one way of legitimizing rule. Why are you in power? Because you won the election. Winning the election is the legitimating basis, institutionalized legitimizing basis for your rule. But in this case, the elections are not that. The elections are a reflection of persistent manipulative use of power over time. So rather than seeing the elections as the basis for power, I think we can look at the elections as just the sort of icing on the cake of what happens after all these years of manipulation. Okay, I hate the slides that you have this picture up there, but anyways, I want to just go through some of the reasons that we think he has support, and I think there could be some interesting discussion at the end of whether we think any of this has changed or whether it's all the same things. But these are the 4 things I want to focus on. So most people know the economic growth story. That's per capita income in constant $22,005, and that's Putin. So you can see that after Putin things get better. That looks good. But I think that the 2008 financial crisis and Crimea remain really important for a change in that trajectory, which is that if you look after 2008, they did not have what they had between 2000 and 2008, which was just a straight line trajectory. There was a financial crisis, which I think psychologically had more of an effect than it did financially to some extent on the country. And 2014, Crimea is overlapping with the collapse of oil prices and big changes in the way gas is priced and other things, and I don't think they have any not only do they not have prospects for high economic growth like they had in the early 2000s, but they don't even have a plan for what they're going to do. So that's the economy. Then if you look at the ideological side of things, I think everybody knows the story of media control with some new twists, like additional crackdown on civil society organizations, universities, the nationalism that Henry talked about, the focus on Russian ethnicity, which I agree completely with Henry that a focus on ethnic nationalism is very dangerous for the regime because it has gotten out of hand for them and they've had to kind of dial back on that. They try to push the Orthodox Church, and that's actually, I think, a very interesting development in the Putin period that was unforeseen in the 1990s, the steep rise in money, support, power of the Orthodox Church, and that's for the time being going along with Putin. But there's tension there, too, in terms of Putin's embrace of the Soviet period, etc. And then the construction of external enemies and people who are out to get us over the years, Ukraine, the Georgians, Europe, NATO, United States. And I would say on this front, the U.S. is certainly helping out. If you look at our strategic military doctrines from the last 4-ish months, I think those are pretty clear indications of a new Cold War, with some differences that I'll get to later. But anyways, that's all on the ideological side. I think that's been a consistent campaign. But something I think that is also worthy of talking about is it's not just media control, it's the use of violence. And when we go through this, we can see the oligarchs. Remember Khodorkovsky in jail? But remember the show of putting him in jail while he was Russia's richest man. Then civil society, the journalists being killed, which continues, threats against protesters, including young kids in 2012, assassinations, Nemtsov, now these spies, it's another piece of it, and the use of military force abroad. So I think when you put these things together, Georgian war, invasion of Crimea, the support for war in Ukraine, and I will point out in the war with Syria, this is the first time that Russia has exercised military power outside the boundaries of the former Soviet state. I think it's quite a significant development. I wouldn't infer from that that they're ready to copy the United States and start a global war on whatever and bomb everywhere. But there is clearly a line has been crossed in terms of using military force, I think, outside of the former Soviet states. But I think we don't want to underestimate the use of violence as one of the tools that the regime is using. So you have the economy, ideational factors, violence, and another piece that I think is really important that in each step may not look so important is the persistent institutional manipulation. So if we remember changes in the electoral system, who cares about those? Those are one step towards making it harder for other parties to run, making it harder for individuals to get into parliament when they got rid of the single member districts. The elimination of governors seemed like, who cares, but actually that leads to problems with people staying in power for decades now, going back from the 90s, some of the governors. The executive manipulation of the president and prime minister posts, that's just another one. But I think one that's really significant and that's absolutely important to understanding the outcomes of the elections as well as the opinion polls is the barring candidates who have any likelihood of getting support from participating in the election. I think that's one of the most important things that they've done, and something that really allows them to control the outcome much more directly than the fraud that comes, at the end. So there's lots. We could probably come up with 50 institutional changes that the Putin regime has introduced over the years that have the combined effect of having taken Russia away from democracy towards authoritarianism, and also have the effect of keeping potential rivals off of the scene. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I think these approval ratings and the elections are the the outcome, the result of all of these tactics rather than the starting point. But you can see clearly that the intervention in Crimea did make Putin more popular in this scenario. And I would not want to discount that as fake, because I think there is a resonance with Crimea that's different from some of the other things. And so I think some of that support is real. But I also want to emphasize that I don't think it's useful to say, are people lying or do they really support Putin? To me, the question is, given that you have a choice of only people you don't really like, which among these people, given your very constrained choice set, would you support? And so the key question is, what if some charismatic, competent person arrived on the scene? That's what is a real threat to the regime, and that's why barring opposition candidates or any potential rival is so important. The election results, in case anybody cared about those numbers, you can see from 2012 to 2018 that Putin dropped his party, but United Russia picked up 13% of the vote compared to their previous. The communists continue their downward decline, and there's a little bit of change, although I think consistency with the LDPR over time. Okay, so why bother holding elections? I couldn't help but add this slide. I don't think the elections are that legitimating for Putin domestically, because people know about the manipulation, they know about the fraud, etc. But nevertheless, so this statement from Shanghai that's okay. You can say, well, Shanghai, what about that? Well, then you have the Civic Chambers Monitoring Group. Well, okay, it's an internal Russian thing, so okay. Donald Trump, whatever. The president of the EU Commission, though, I think this is one of the most egregious incidents of external legitimating of dictatorship. And so maybe that's worth it in itself to have the president of the EU Commission send a congratulatory note like that, which Putin would not have gotten if he didn't have this fraudulent election. So I think when we look at where is legitimacy coming from in the elections, I would say there is a case to be made that there's external legitimacy, even if it doesn't have a big effect internally. Okay, so what to expect? I'm wrapping up here. One, I don't want to say Putin is not popular. He is popular, but as I said, the support is based on careful manipulation of potential opposition, and that is going to have to continue for him to maintain support. He has to continue a relentless hunt for potential rivals, and that has costs. This terrible tragedy in Kemerovo, where all these kids died, is the result of corrupt practices of Elaine Tulayev. And why is he in power? He is in power because he's a Putin loyalist. And why weren't they doing fire inspections? Because his entire regime is corrupt, and this kind of corruption leads to very terrible outcomes for the population. So there are costs to surrounding yourself with corrupt rather than competent people. I think the limits of media and institutional levers, I don't know, has it been reached? That's a good question. Like, could they do more? The internet is another frontier that they don't have the capacity for, but possibly they could do more to restrict internet access to information. But I think they're also going to continue to use violence itself to maintain power. And I think that their low legitimacy in major cities is going to continue to be a problem for them. And I have Navalny just up there. I think Navalny is a major problem for the regime, and I think it's very hard to understand why he is not either in jail or exiled or worse, without considering he must have some kind of support from somewhere. Maybe that's getting into the realm of conspiracy, but I think that he presents a major challenge to the regime, and the fact of his existence that he keeps going also suggests to me it's not just his activities are a problem, but the fact that the state hasn't done more to stop him suggests some weaknesses. The weakening economy is the second point, what to expect. I don't see any plans for modernization, diversification, something or other. They're just going to keep hoping for the best. And maybe oil and gas prices will go up a bit and that will be enough for them, but I think they're in a big, they are facing some serious problems. Not to mention the sanctions, the oligarchs being worried about their own money, not to mention the lack of action so far by the United States and Britain on financial transparency and offshore accounts. We could, any day now, decide to do something about that, and that would have a major effect. And I think that they're increasingly aware of that. And then finally, I'll just end on the dangerous external disorder. Russia remains threatened by extremist violence. The situation in Ukraine has not been resolved, and it's dangerous not only for the people there, I think, but for the regime. I think Syria, as the current weekend days news reports show, that's another area of real danger for not just people in Syria, but also for Russia and the United States. And finally, I would be happy to talk about what's different about this new Cold War. But I think that the U.S.-Russian relations and the unpredictability of U.S. policy presents a number of problems for the regime.
Okay, thank you so much, Yoi. All right, we're going to next turn it over to Professor Graham Robertson, who's a professor of political science at UNC Chapel Hill. His work focuses on political protest and competition between rulers and their challenges in contemporary authoritarian systems. His recent publications include work on political institutions in authoritarian regimes, analysis of structural and political factors that shape regime dynamics, and studies of the factors that shape support for and opposition to autocrats. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham, and also to mention again that he'll be speaking on some of that research tomorrow at 3 o'clock here. But, okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and for everyone for coming. I was kind of expecting that we'd all sort of say the same thing and it'd be hard to find points of disagreement. But I'm pleased to say that I have at least nuanced disagreement with Henry, more substantial, I think, disagreement with Yoi, so I think there's going to be room for some discussion. I want to make 3 points, essentially. I want to talk about what the basis of the regime is in Russia, so we really engage fairly directly with what Yoi was talking about. I want to talk about, secondly, I want to talk about what was the real election here. I think there was a real competition of sorts here, and I think it has implications for what we're going to see going forward that are interesting, even if only in the fine print. And then I want to think about the implications for the next term, primarily in terms of domestic policy, but a little bit also foreign policy. So the first point is about the basis of the regime. I think that one of the challenges that electoral authoritarian regimes have, this is dictatorships that have elections with some form of competition in them, is to put on a show, right? And they have to put on this election, and they have to have candidates, and they have to have, register the right candidates, which is the first kind of stage in the process. That's often harder than it looks. The Iranians back in 2009 made the mistake of allowing the wrong people to register, and that caused all sorts of chaos later. And so the regime has to handle that. They had to handle the Navalny question, which they did. They excluded him, and they excluded him without all that much cost, which I thought was a sign of their competence and success. Then they have to hold the election. They have to organize a landslide victory, right? And they have to have people participate in it. And they have to cheat, but they have to not cheat too much, and they have to cheat in a way where it's not too obvious, or if it is obvious, no one takes it seriously. Right? This was a great election where it was really obvious and really well known and nobody cared, right? As opposed to the previous election, in the parliamentary elections where everybody surprised, people started to care for some reason, right? Which I think still remains a little weird and unclear why they did in the past. So I think getting the large and even enthusiastic participation of tens of millions of Russian citizens in an election is a big success for the regime. It's a really solid recovery from the tricky period of 2011 and 2012. Yes, the election was not free and fair. Yes, the candidates that were allowed to run, and the media coverage made that absolutely an impossibility, whatever happened on election day. Yes, there was lots of different kinds of mobilization, workplace mobilization in particular, which has become the center. Political scientists used to worry about the Putin regime because they felt there was no identifiable, what they called punishment regime. There was no way to punish and reward people for showing up to vote that was identifiable because there wasn't a kind of network of brokers or a well-established political party. And what we've discovered is that's what state enterprises are for, right? And large private enterprises for that matter, and they run workplace mobilization pretty effectively through them. But even with all of that, I think this was a very substantial political victory for the Kremlin. In the run-up to the elections, there was talk of, from about a year ago, of the 70-70 strategy, right? So they had to assure 70% turnout, and they had to get 70% of the vote for Putin. And about when the period of the parliamentary elections came around, we were all laughing at that, right? There was considerable mockery at the very idea that they could engineer this kind of turnout, in particular, and also this kind of vote for Putin without fraud that was so ridiculous that it would be even more embarrassing than have a lower turnout. And in the end, what happened was they came pretty close to hitting that target, even with widespread falsifications, but the kind of falsifications that nobody really did very much about. And this is all in the context of, as Joey demonstrated, a really continuously sluggish economic performance. The economy's been doing pretty badly consistently since the financial crisis. We're almost a decade up now where the growth that was supposed to be the basis of Putin's regime just hasn't really been there. And so something else is going on. And I think what's going on is that we as political scientists have put way too much weight in studying autocracies on things like punishment regimes, on material rewards for particular groups in the population, and we put too much weight in general on economics. And I think what happened instead is that since 2012, what Putin has really done is effectively reorient political competition in Russia away from economics to issues of patriotism and conservatism. What he's done is he's mobilized wedge issues of traditional values, for example, issues of ethnicity to a certain extent, but much more ethnicity of loyalty, much more questions of loyalty to the state. And that's become the basis of his political strategy. He's reoriented politics to be not one about haves and have-nots or urban versus rural or any of those kinds of, or communists versus liberals, but it's now a competition between normal, patriotic Russians on the one hand, and foreign-influenced, dangerous liberals on the other. Right? And for most people in Russia, it's just not hard to see which side of that divide you're on. Right? And then after Crimea, all this went on steroids. Right? Crimea produced the classic moment in which you could make these divides. And for these reasons, there's good data on this, and for those of you that have nothing better to do on a Friday afternoon, you can come and hear about it tomorrow. Putin is not just genuinely popular, but he's actually loved. Or if not loved, he's at least admired, trusted, and a source of pride for lots of people in Russia. This is true, I think, and it is demonstrable by data. Now, it's the product of all of the institutional manipulation and the TV manipulation and all of that goes on that Joey pointed out, absolutely. But politicians' popularity always is. Consent is manufactured. It's manufactured by the institutions. It's manufactured by the media, right? In a competitive or non-competitive environment. Either way, there isn't some kind of natural level of popularity out there that kind of you could find if you could take away all the the machinations of politics. It's just that's not really a thing. So politics in Russia has been reoriented onto emotions and to sort of deep psychological orientations toward politics. And you know what? I think that's the way politics in much of the world has become reoriented anyway. So Russian politics looks in some ways more like politics in the West, or politics in the West has come to look more like Russian politics, which may be even worse way to think about it, than we might think. And so that I think is one of the real key lessons of the whole post-2012 period, and something that we ignore at our peril. Relatedly, of course, given the way that Russian politics work and the way official media work, Putin has become himself the focus of much of this emotional and psychological attachment. And I think that has serious implications for the second term. And this is where I think a little bit of there's some nuanced disagreement here with what Henry was talking about. in that context, with that personalization of power, I think finding a successor is going to be hard. And it's going to take time, and it's going to need luck. So routinizing or passing on Putin's charisma is going to be difficult. From Putin's perspective, I think this is good, actually, because it takes this whole lame duck issue and kicks it down the road. It's much harder to see how they can address that issue in the short term. They're going to need to really come up with something pretty elaborate, you know, on the kind of 1999 level, I think, and that might take time. It's hard for me to see how the parliamentary elections, at least the way they've been run so far, can become a vehicle for a real test of strength, especially not a test of strength amongst two different groups. That would be a really interesting, but I think it's difficult to see how that would actually work. So I think this routinization, this issue of the difficulty of routinizing Putin's charisma actually really means that the succession issue is going to be a little further off than some of us are thinking. So that said, is there anything, how do we interpret the meaning of the election? This is my second point. Is there actually any kind of real election going on here? I agree with you 100%. This is very, very different from a Western election. It has very different meaning even than previous Russian elections, I think. This is an election without competition for the top spot, right? That's a pretty strange kind of elections. But there was real competition amongst parts of the opposition, both on the liberal side and on the communist side, I think on the left opposition. In this sense, I think there was two losers. One was Udaltsov and the kind of youth brand of the communists that were the kind of the next wave of Communist Party voters that we were expecting, or some people were expecting to come along. Udaltsov put enormous support behind Grudinin, and it didn't work out. It did nothing for Grudinin's support, and I think that really damages Udaltsov and the kind of the prospects of the future of the communists inventing themselves. On the liberal side, there was also real competition, not a real election, but some competition, and the big loser on this was Sobchak and I think probably the Kremlin. Right? Sobchak's effort, Kremlin-inspired or not, to launch a takeover of the liberal camp spectacularly failed. For all the excitement that she generated in New York, in Russia, it was a total flop. The campaign was poorly run. It lacked a clear message. It lacked any kind of consistent themes. And the contrast with the kind of detail-oriented, practical, problem-oriented campaign that Navalny ran for the Moscow mayor office was really dramatic, I think, for everyone to see. And so if this was indeed a Kremlin project, then I think it's fair to say that it spectacularly backfired. What it did was re-establish Navalny's bona fides as the only potential serious vehicle for opposition politics in Russia. And I think that's pretty significant. That's a significant result of the elections. Finally, just a few words on looking forward. I don't think we should expect much in the way of radical changes as a result of this election. There are a number of reasons for this. I think Putin's address to the nation and then some of the things we've heard since the election really show that his basic message, which is that life in Russia is hard and we're surrounded by enemies. And so what we need is more social spending and more defense spending going forward. That's been the message for some time, and I think that's going to be the message going forward. What's slightly different, although not at all entirely new, is a bigger stress on technological achievements in order to achieve this, to handle these problems domestically, both in the social sphere and in the defense sphere. That I think is something that is part of the reinvigoration, if you like, strategy of the regime. They're going to hear more about that. There's a lot of talk of personnel changes in the government in order to achieve this. Much talk of Prime Minister Kudrin. But I think for all of that talk, even if the personnel changes are really pretty extensive, I don't think that's going to add up to very much. Because I think we probably all agree on this, that without fundamental changes to things like property rights and governance, to freedom of information, freedom of access on the internet, the kind of step improvement in productivity and technological progress that Putin's talking about is going to be very, very hard to achieve outside of some fairly limited, narrow, state-targeted projects. So I would expect to see continuity rather than change in domestic politics. I suspect that's probably going to be the same in foreign policy. I don't expect to see much backing off from the separatists in eastern Ukraine. I would be surprised to see kind of a pro-Western turn. I think Henry is got lots of data and lots of experience, and is not crazy, so it could happen. But I personally would be pretty surprised to see it, because I think most of the costs of conflict with the West have already been paid up front. And there's lots of benefits to keeping banging on that thing. I don't think you need to invade somewhere else in order to keep politics being a kind of about patriotism and loyalty. American politics has been about patriotism and loyalty for a very long time. Right? And people run on the same issues over and over again, paying lip service to things without anything really happening. And I think there's no reason to suspect that that's not the case with Russia. So I don't think there's going to be another Crimea. There is no other Crimea. There's no place quite like Crimea in so many ways, but especially as a political vehicle. And I think the road to a settlement in the Donbass is really hard just to imagine without radical political changes in Moscow that just are not on the horizon.
Okay, all right, thanks, Graham. Our final speaker today is Kimberly Martin, who's a frequent guest here at the Jordan Center. She's the Ann Whitney Olin Professor of Political Science at Barnard College University, and is the director of the program on U.S.-Russian relations at Columbia's Harriman Institute. In March 2017, the Council on Foreign Relations published her special report, Reducing Tensions Between Russia and NATO. So I wonder, hopefully she'll talk a little bit on that topic and how that's going right now in her remarks. She's written a number of books. She's a frequent media commentator, and actually, near and dear to my heart, she managed to accomplish my dream in life, which was that after we got a piece of hers on the monkey cage, she ended up on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Now, I don't think it may not have been a direct link from the monkey cage, and the New York Times op-ed might have had something to do with it too, but she's also accomplished that. So anyway, we're very pleased to have her back here again today.
Thanks,
rounding
Josh.
out our panel.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And as you who are academics know, you sometimes don't have any control over the title that they give your work. My title was not Reducing Tensions Between Russia and NATO, it was Managing Tensions Between Russia and NATO, and they decided that wasn't sexy enough at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm going to only focus on foreign policy today. I really learned a lot from the other speakers, and I'm glad that I had the chance to just be here as a fly on the wall and hear what they had to say. I do not expect that there's going to be much change in Russian foreign policy going forward, and that's because foreign policy decisions are made completely by Putin and the very small group around him, and no one is actually sure where the individual decisions come from. They are not at all bureaucratized. Russians tell us that the presidential administration is the organization that's responsible for coordinating the decisions in foreign policy, but the presidential administration does not contain any big voices when it comes to foreign policy questions, and it doesn't have a deep bench of expertise. So I think it's really Putin and the close cohort around him, and it may not be the same people who are making every decision. What we do know is that there's been absolutely no role for the foreign ministry for many years, so we've heard about this possibility that Sergei Lavrov might be retiring sometime soon. I don't think it'll make a bit of difference if he does, because in recent years he's essentially just been a spokesperson for what Putin wants. And there certainly is no role for think tanks or for journalists, much less for the public, in trying to have an influence over foreign policy. What we've seen is that the regime will announce something that has happened without any debate preceding that announcement, and then everybody falls in line behind it, and so there's no debate after an announcement has been made. I think one thing we should keep in mind, though, that sometimes gets lost in the rhetoric in our own media, is that Russian foreign policy and security policy has actually not been very cohesive. And that might come as a surprise to people because, we think about this new Cold War possibility and it's all anti-Western, and the problem is it hasn't been very strategic. And let me just give you a few examples that, I'm not unique in talking about, but things to think about how Putin has really sort of blown it for himself by decisions that he's taken that support this anti-Western drumbeat, but don't really get him much in terms of the interests of the Russian state. The first obvious one was taking over the territory of Crimea and thereby losing the whole cohort of pro-Russian voters in Ukraine. That was just, it gave him the Kremnash boost, but it left him with an anti-Russian state on his border that had been at least moving in a pro-Russian direction before that. Another example was his famous pivot to China a couple of years ago, which was supposed to be how Russia could leave the West and still get support. And what we've seen from that is both that China has been kind of mixed in its support of Russia. It's given some funding, some investments, but only from sovereign funds that don't themselves get subject to Western sanctions. Furthermore, it's really sort of drawn Russia deeper and deeper into China's orbit at a time when China is genuinely on the rise. And a lot of experts in Russia are very angry about that decision because they feel that, China is going to have economic superiority and defense superiority eventually, and that Russia will continue to be a raw materials supplier to what amounts to almost a new imperial power on its borders. And a third example, what we've seen recently yet again, is that Putin's decision to support Assad in Syria has really cost him support in the broader world community because he is stuck supporting Assad's use of chemical weapons. And that really undercuts a big part of how the Soviet Union, much less Russia, approached the international community beforehand, because the Soviet Union and Russia were always against the idea of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And now Putin has left himself stuck with it, which is really harming Russia even more than some other actions would be harming Russia in the UN Security Council, for example. And so I don't expect any change, but on the other hand, I think we overemphasize the degree to which it has some sort of cohesive policy behind it. I don't think elections will affect that much. As other people have talked about, there's really no strong pro-Western voice anywhere in Russia that would come up to challenge Putin. And as Graham pointed out, we saw what that meant for Ksenia Sobchak, who was really the most pro-Western voice in the campaign, and she got a personal result. I do agree with Henry that the Russian population is not naturally anti-Western. For those of you who follow the Russian news, you've probably seen this yourself, but there's this drumbeat of anti-Western content in the news that just comes out on a daily basis. And the part that's been most striking to me is the extraordinarily competitive evening news programs that always have, they have people standing behind podiums, and it's all the experts, and it's the same experts every night. There's a little bit of change, but not much. And it's always talking about some foreign policy question, and it's always anti-American. And you would think that people would get sick of this and stop watching it, but apparently they don't, and it still gets viewers, which is kind of amazing. But when you think about it, the middle class in Russia likes to travel to the West. They miss things like Western cheese. So I think that if Putin were to suddenly find a way of saying that now he's had a victory and shown that the West has to pay attention to him, he could actually get popular support behind some kind of opening to the West. And I think what has made the population have an easy time following behind Putin is the idea of lost status after the Cold War resonating so much with the Russian population, and he's sort of taken that lost status issue and turned it into anti-Westernism. But I think an awful lot of actions that the West has taken have fed into that, and the more that the West continues to challenge Russian status by the various actions it's taking, the more we might find Putin having an incentive to keep on playing up the anti-Westernism. And so we have to remember that there is a little bit, at least, of that action-reaction dynamic in there as well. Let me just say a bit about the sanctions, especially the ones that were put into effect last week. I think in general, the sanctions have been an excuse for Putin's poor economic performance. We know that really the cause of the poor economic performance has been a combination of the collapse of oil prices, the failure to diversify the economy away from being a resource exporter, and then all the corruption that some of the other speakers have spoken about. And the fact of Western sanctions being stayed in place so long helped Putin try to convince the population that that's the cause of economic stagnation. But I think that the sanctions that went into place Friday changed things, and they were really surprising. And the one that was most surprising to me was the sanctioning of Viktor Vekselberg. So I don't know how many of you have followed who Vekselberg is. His wife and his two children are both American citizens. They may be co-citizens have dual citizenship, but they're Americans. He owns property, including a very large house in Connecticut, in the United States. He is pro-Trump. His cousin, who is an American citizen, gave a major donation to the Trump campaign. Vexelberg himself helped pay for Trump's inauguration. That's something that you're not required to be an American citizen to do. Vexelberg attended the inauguration. And when you look at what Vexelberg has done, I mean, he gives lots of money to charity, including being one of the founders of the big Jewish museum in Moscow. Putin was picking on him recently. There were a variety of FSB raids on Vexelberg properties in Moscow. He was criticized for supposedly stealing money from the Skolkovo project for high technology that he was founding outside of Moscow. So he was a very odd choice. It may turn out that we know why the sanctions were put on him. I have a suspicion that it might have something to do with the regional airports that he owns in Russia. He is the owner of the Rostov airport, and we learned from a Reuters investigation last week why that Rostov airport is significant. It's because late at night, that is where the Russian mercenaries go on unofficial flights into Syria from Russian territory. And so because we know how things work in Russia, that probably means that Vexelberg is getting a little bit of a profit off the use of Russian mercenaries in Syria. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is at least one of the reasons why the US decided to punish him. But what it has meant is that all of a sudden, not only Vexelberg's investments have seen a decline in interest from international investors, but now everybody is just thinking that if Vexelberg can be attacked, anybody can be attacked by the sanctions, and it's become sort of a hot potato, and so nobody wants to put any money into Russia. And so I predict that this actually will have a significant effect, potentially, on Russian economic growth in a way that the other sanctions were touching on in terms of energy, for example, and new innovations in energy. This one might really end up having a big effect because it looks like it's targeting random oligarchs rather than people who are necessarily all that close to the Russian regime. But I think, again, this means, as Graham said, that Putin doesn't really have an incentive to change things because they're going to put random sanctions on him. Why not just continue the way things are? But it also means he doesn't have an incentive to do anything else violent abroad because he has no reason to put even more sanctions against him because it's making economic recovery more difficult. Let me just get onto my pet issue, which is, and I'll shift the topic here a little bit and just talk about it for a few minutes. My biggest concern today is that the political climate on both sides, because of this new atmosphere of Cold War, which is the drumbeat in Washington is every bit as strong as the drumbeat in Moscow, is that we are in a situation where all of the arms control agreements that have really been something that mitigated the hostile relationship between Russia and the West over the past 20 to 30 years, going back to the ABM Treaty, actually, of 1970, of the early 1970s, they're all under stress. And what matters is not even that they might lead to new weapons development and a new arms race, but that the constant meetings that were related to those arms control negotiations and even the arms control verifications were a means for the two sides to communicate with each other about crucial security information and a way for each side to try to find the signals through the noise of what was going on and to be able to understand the other side's signals well. And this was a major theme of a conference that we held at the Harriman Institute for the Program on U.S.-Russia Relations a couple of weeks ago, and there seemed to be agreement on both the Russian and the American side of the participants that this loss of the ability to understand and hear and interpret each other's signals through the noise could be very dangerous. And it matters in particular because of all the dangerous military activities that we've seen recently, everything from the shooting down of the Russian plane on the border with Turkey and Syria a few years ago, to the use of mercenaries in Syria and what that means for communication. And one thing that is really bad, from my perspective in particular, is the absence of military-to-military dialogue, which has been in place in the US-Soviet relationship, again, ever since the early 1970s, and is now completely gone. And it's the fault of both sides. It's the fault of the Russians because they never really took as much advantage of it as they could because they always saw military-to-military dialogue opportunities as a way for the United States to try to turn the Russian military against the leadership. But it's a particular fault of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Senate vote, which ever since 2015 has considered military-to-military talks to be something they were sanctioning Russia about by preventing the State Department from funding them. So, given Henry's thought that maybe there's an opportunity for Putin to move a little bit in a pro-Western direction, given that he's maybe now really being harmed by sanctions in a way that was not so true before. I think the U.S. has an opportunity, and I think that the initiative for it has to come from the U.S. Because if the U.S. now were actually to go to Putin and say, at this maybe upcoming summit that Trump and Putin have been talking about, maybe it's time to reopen military-to-military dialogue and to talk a little bit about arms control issues. Putin could take it home as a victory. Look, you know, my standing up to the West worked out. They finally had to come and negotiate on my side. That's exactly what the 1970s arms control talks were all about. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy in Q&A to talk about any foreign policy question regarding Russia that is now on anybody's mind.
Okay, thanks all of you so much. I'm going to ask a couple questions and let Alex ask a couple questions, then we'll open it up more. There's so many things here to chew on, and so many interesting things have been raised. Let me go like one domestic and then one maybe a little bit more foreign. So on the domestic one, I feel like there was a bit of dancing around Navalny. Like that there was, you know, Navalny was brought up at the end, he was mentioned, you know, from Henry's kind of perspective, if this is all about regime insiders. I would love to hear just a little bit more about where we think where we stand with looking at what Navalny is doing. So Graham, you sort of you didn't quite call Navalny a winner of the election, but you certainly called Sobchak and the Kremlin a loser of the election. And so I'm wondering, in the aftermath of the election and everything else that's been talked about looking forward, right? Where do we look to Navalny and Navalny's, you know, cadre of young supporters, and small that they may be, or cadre of older supporters, small that they may be, if we're trying to get a sense of what's going on in Russia? Is this a distraction? Is it a sideshow? Is this all going to really be, like, from a kind of Henry paternalism, perspective, is this all going to be about watching what happens with the elites around Putin, and when does Putin start to designate a successor, or when does Putin start to drop back, and then we just have to look what happens within the elite? Or is Navalny still actually a relevant person? Has he somehow been strengthened by the election? Now, his boycott idea seems to have not worked if we got close to the 70-70, and there were certainly scenes of, you know, there was one media spin on things where the election ends up with Navalny and Sobchak fighting with each other, and maybe not provoke, you know, having Sobchak be stronger was a failure for the Kremlin, but the idea that part of the narrative was that the liberals can't get along with each other and they're, you know, criticizing each other. And so I'd just be interested to hear this. Like, if we want to understand what happens, put it this way, if we want to understand what happens with Russia moving forward in the coming years, how important is it going to be to watch Navalny and what Navalny does, or is this, you know, besides the point?
Do you want me to?
I mean, I'm open.
Okay,
yeah, I'm interested in hearing. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, whatever order you'd like to go.
Okay, yeah, great. So, yeah, very interesting. I mean, I guess, like, just to address some of the points that you mentioned and it came up, I think the fact that Navalny is out of jail now, right, or alive, signals that he's considered more of a threat dead or in jail than he is, you know, alive and free. So they kind of, I think they see him as a possible, you know, source of inspiration should he be taken out of the political scene, which I think is a sign that they worry about the public support that he potentially wields, and that the backlash against anything happening to him could be pretty significant. I mean, I think there is some evidence for that. I mean, he registers at very low levels in opinion polls, right, in the presidential races. But there's a question that I and some of my colleagues have been running in surveys over the last few years in Russia about basically giving people a list of politicians and asking, is this a person who, you know, whose time has already passed? Is this a person who's needed right now in the present moment? Or is this somebody whose time is yet to come? And he's consistently been the leader on that metric, even though there are a lot of people that say they don't know him or kind of give a neutral response. You know, he comes out higher you know, than pretty much all the other politicians, including the younger ones in the Kremlin, at least those that we've tested, which I think kind of is something that you know, it says something about why he's still there and his potential appeal. I mean, I do think he has charisma, probably, you know, one of the very few people in the opposition that actually has it. And I think one reason for it is maybe a little unpleasant for us, which is that he can credibly tap into this anti-migrant nationalism that the Kremlin really fears. And so, you know, he can mobilize a much broader base of support than someone like Sobchak, who at least in her rhetoric has indicated something more closer to sort of a nice European type of nationalist appeal. Whereas I think, you know, he has the potential to draw a much broader coalition in the future, which is why I think that he's feared and actually does have a political future.
I'll add something. I agree with much of what Henry said, but I don't think the only reason for him is his purported nationalist stance, because I think that the anti-corruption message is a message that virtually every person in Russia understands very deeply, and that's been a consistent theme from the beginning. And he branches out into new areas with his YouTube channel, and those messages get results. His message last year against the Prime Minister got 26 million people to view his video, and a substantial protest last March. His recent one against Deripaska, I think, was very well done, and that I think led to the threats to shut down Instagram and YouTube unless he took it down. So I think those are showing that there is concern in the regime about what he's up to. He has his next planned protest is in June. I mean, he has this kind of lackadaisical schedule as an opposition, like, I'm going away for the summer to my dacha, but be back in September for something. And so there's like a okay, we'll do this again next year kind of thing. And I get the sense he's waiting, and even the head of the election commission said, well, you know, it's 5 years since a conviction until he can run, and so he's still within 5 years, but after 10 years, he might be able to run. And so they kind of left the door open a little bit for him. But I think that I think we don't really know because of the constraints on his actual ability to run for anything. People know that he's not allowed to run, so I think if you ask, would you support him, it's hard to separate that from you won't, he's not actually a candidate. But I think that if he's part of this concerted effort to keep the message of there's no one but Putin alive, and so I think he constantly threatens that message, and so that's another reason he's a real problem for the regime.
On Navalny, I just want to make 2 points. The first is that his brother is a hostage, right? His brother is held in jail, and that means that there are real limits on how far Navalny is willing to push things, and that means they don't have to put him in prison and they don't have to kill him because they already have a hostage. The second point is that Navalny is extraordinarily useful to the regime. His videos on Putin have not said anything new. They have not had details about Putin's financial dealings. They've had nasty words, but lots of people say nasty words about Putin. His video on Medvedev was devastating, and it had such incredible detail that it makes me think that he didn't do that alone. He got help from somebody, whether he realizes who gave him help or not. The video on Deripaska, I mean, maybe that is had a result in the sanctions that were put on Deripaska on Friday. But I think that we should be asking ourselves, given this pattern, of to whom in Russia might it be useful to have Deripaska be the fall guy? Graham.
Interesting. I totally agree with you about his brother being, you know, that was one of the most brilliant acts of evil sentencing I've ever seen. We were all kind of thinking, was Navalny going to jail or was he not? And none of us were cynical and sinister enough to come up with what they actually did, which was to free him and jail his brother. So I mean, I really think that was a kind of evil genius of sorts. I think Navalny comes out of these elections with an enhanced reputation. He has support. He has. I mean, some of these videos, the guy's a political genius of sorts. I mean, I think it really is spectacular, and I think I agree with Yoey that it goes up well beyond the nationalist era. I think the nationalist era of his career doesn't do him any harm, but I think he's moved into a much more pro-Western, much more liberal values mode than he used to be in. The only thing I could add really to what's been said so far is that he has real supporters elected in city councils, and that's real. That's actually a thing. And you know, how significant that's going to be going forward is hard to say, because he has that real problem that under current circumstances He's not been allowed to run, and it won't be too hard to find other ways to bar him from running going forward. So he won't be on a ballot for national office unless something very major changes. So in answer to the question, is he the main thing to look at or a sideshow? Well, he's the main thing in opposition politics. But opposition politics for now is a sideshow. It's an interesting sideshow, but it remains very much a sideshow.
Yeah, Alex.
So great panel, really interesting. I want to pick up, my question relates to something that Kim mentioned on the new style sanctions. And because we are trying to marry sort of public policy with sort of analytical sort of theorizing, I wanted just to open this up, whoever wants to take it. What is your sense about this argument that the way to really hurt Putin is to sanction the oligarchs in this targeted individual manner? Like, do you find the sort of causal argument that, amateur political theorists and leading think tanks sort of, who are really pushing this line, is this what oligarchs care about, the capacity to travel, their reputation, the schooling, that whole thing. And how would we know? What should we look at, right? So we're seeing a lot of this sort of commentary and coverage in the FT. Roussel is getting absolutely destroyed. Aluminum prices are, going haywire. Is this, the actual kind of sanction that can do real damage? But what's the connection between this oligarch circle now, right, not in sort of the formative part, and Putin's power, and what kind of impact will this have, if at all, like positive, negative?
I'll say something. I think a lot of people have tried to study in our field, in political science and international relations, the effect of sanctions. And it's a very, very hard thing to do, but the first round of Russian sanctions, I would say, and the Iran sanctions to some degree, are dramatically different from all previous sanctions. So trying to understand whether sanctions in general have an effect on a regime, you have to say, what's the effect? What is the effect? What's the goal? Like, you have a goal and then you say, was that goal met? And then you could say the sanctions were effective. But what's our goal? Our goal was to send a signal that we didn't like the invasion of Crimea. Our goal wasn't that the sanctions themselves would get Putin out of Crimea. Maybe it was for some people. But if you have even a more limited goal of sending a signal, I think in the first round, the sanctions did send a signal. But I think also the focus on the dollarization of trade as a tool for U.S. foreign policy is incredibly dangerous for the United States. And were it not for the total weakness of any other currency, we would be in big trouble. So I think the sanctions are a double-edged sword for us. But the targeting didn't really work because we targeted industries and people. I mean, I think another thing, the sanctions process in the United States is so under-institutionalized. A phone call from the White House to Treasury, 2 small paragraphs of these executive orders, followed by a press release from Treasury with no oversight of or analysis of who's on the list. It's just whoever is in the Treasury that's putting out that list, and we don't know anything until we see the list. So there's this strange process in the U.S. for the sanctions. Then there's the careful, to some extent, targeting of firms and the idea that it's going to hit industries that are important to the regime. But what does Putin do in the first round? He puts his own food sanctions on. Why is there no French cheese in Russia? Because of Putin's sanctions. And it is not Western sanctions, it's not US sanctions that stopped European food imports. It's the retaliatory measure by Putin to make immediately all food prices go up, imported goods go down, and the elite suffered from that. But Putin has been very successful in saying the sanctions are the fault of the West, not we put in these sanctions that increase food prices and it's our move. So actually, I think despite all the efforts to carefully target them to certain places, the Russian retaliatory sanctions shifted the public understanding of those. But I still think the first round had the effect of shocking the elite around Putin to maybe say, like, wait a minute, like, were you going to go further into Crimea, further into Ukraine, And maybe that had an effect. But at this round, you look at the timing, and it looked like last year, you remember, Josh? Last year in January, sanctions, I thought firmly, sanctions were going to be gotten rid of 1 week after the inauguration. And everyone, Josh and I were you there too, Henry? We were at this conference, and everybody had to reschedule what's going to happen on Saturday because the sanctions were going to be taken off, and other people were going to be on TV. And then that Friday was the immigration ban, and all the chaos that caused. And Theresa May was visiting the United States. So then the sanctions weren't gotten rid of that day. But what happened the next week? Michael Flynn. So then with the traitorous behavior of Michael Flynn and the immigration ban, you had to wait a little. But the Michael Flynn story didn't get better, and Congress acted to tie the hands of the president in terms of getting, and so now I think we're like in Jackson Vanik land. We're never going to get rid of the sanctions. There's a congressional part to it now, and so we're just stuck with them regardless of what effect they have or who's on the list or whatever. So I think we're just in a different world with them now in terms of our policy goals.
Okay, Kim?
Yeah, I agree with what Yoey has said, and I just want to clarify that I don't think that targeting the specific individuals who were targeted on Friday is going to make them turn away from the Putin regime, and that's going to be the end of the Putin regime. I think that the unexpected economic effects that have had the ripple effects out of seeming to target random individuals may have an effect over the long term. It's very hard to know what actually sustains the Putin regime because it's all done at such a very quiet level, but my own sense is that the Putin regime is sustained by the intelligence agencies. And it's not one intelligence agency, and he's done a very good job of managing conflicts between them and to sort of, divide and rule between them. But those are the tools that he uses. He has so much of his own money from everything we know. He doesn't need the money that's coming from those oligarchs. And I think there's also a real danger that sanctioning particular oligarchs will have the effect of drawing them closer to Putin because he becomes their only protector. And so I'm disappointed that we have had sanctions as our default foreign policy option. It shows a lack of creativity on our part, I think.
Henry?
Yeah, I think what I'll say kind of reinforces some of what Kim said. Just at the outset, I'd say just for sanctions in general, right? You talk to the architects of the sanctions. They say, the goals were primarily to, get Putin to the negotiating table in Ukraine and stop him from going further, so they claim success, and to send a signal of dissatisfaction. And so it seems like this signal of dissatisfaction is kind of anchored in policy now and will be very hard to reverse. In terms of the actual effects, I just relate some research that I've got a paper with Mikhail Alexeyev, which is kind of looking at these effects, whether or not the sanctions have led to a backlash or what it's done to public support. And our finding is that basically there's no kind of scapegoating effect. Like Putin pays a price among people who think the economy is doing worse, but there's a peculiar kind of backlash effect. Doesn't work so much among the poor, but basically what it does is the sanctions seem to have reversed the relationship between income and support for Putin. So if before the sanctions were implemented, it was primarily, basically kind of the richer people were more likely to be in some kind of opposition or more skeptical. Now it seems like the richer you are, there's a stronger correlation with actually supporting Putin. Of course, we don't have actual oligarchs in our survey. I wish we did. They declined to participate for some reason. So we can't exactly extrapolate, but I think it does show that people whose economic success has been kind of higher, presumably whose fortunes have been tied closer to the regime and have done fairly well in the regime, their response has been to become apparently more loyal, rather than more skeptical. And so I think that kind of at least potentially reinforces this idea that it may be kind of generating kind of a peculiar sort of rally backlash, which isn't evident in the broad population, but is evident among the specific subpopulation of people who are doing kind of better than average economically.
I'll make an observation here, which is that it's interesting listening to this discussion as a whole, because if we think about what are some sort of ironclad laws of politics that we think we know, right? We can think of selectorate theory, that you have to have the support of some degree of the elites or who are around you if you're not in a system where it's the electorate that's going to determine who's going to bring you in and who's going to bring you out. And so this idea that you can continue to alienate the people who are around Putin without it ever being a consequence for Putin kind of flies in the face of a lot of the ways that we tend to think about how autocrats stay in power, that they have to maintain some amount. And then on top of...
But it entirely depends on who you understand through this electorate. And I think what Kim said, and I agree entirely, what we know about Russian politics under Putin is that oligarchs are replaceable.
Yeah.
And oligarchs who fight the state lose.
Yeah.
And Putin's support is from the intelligence agencies, from other parts of the state.
But is the entire...
To the extent they're nationalized because they can't travel and they can't have access to funds.
But they can also, I mean, if they can travel anywhere in the world, they can just relocate. We're talking about sanctioning people who have, you know, tens of billions of dollars in their assets. The sanctions are they may be painful in some way, but they're not going to destroy their assets.
But are we at the point now, if we're going to talk about that it's propped up by the intelligence services, there's multiple intelligence services, he's got these people who have gotten phenomenally wealthy under him, but they're replaceable. Is the argument here that he has made himself so indispensable, right, that anyone in the elite circle around him is replaceable at this point? I mean, would we go so far as to say that it's not, there is no, I mean, that you know, so then from that perspective, the sanctions are completely misguided in this sense of like cracking. I don't even know if that was the point of the sanctions in the first place, but just sort of saying that, you know, it's a big thing to say you've got an autocrat who's become so indispensable that anyone in the electorate around them is replaceable. At the same respect, and also just picking up on Graham's thing before, I think one of the most provocative things you've said that has been said this whole time here is that like we have this long-standing belief that the way you stay in power in both democracies and in non-democracies is you have to pay attention to the overall economic well-being of the population, right? Or you have to use strong amounts of repression and enrich a small part of the population while not caring about the economic well-being of the rest of the population. And so Graham's position here of like that we've sort of shifted away. Now, maybe you're saying we've shifted away from politics being about distributing economic spoils in terms of redistribution into a question about nationalism, but it's a larger claim, I think, to make that we've shifted away from the position where it doesn't quite matter if you improve the economy. You know, we had the chart, right? Like we can easily, and Dan Treisman's article was showing these trends between economic conditions and popularity across Yeltsin and Putin 1. We have this chart where we can easily see through 2008 that this dynamic, improve the economy, more support for the Russian ruler, is very much at play. But this idea that we've both simultaneously gotten away from the masses caring about economic well-being, but also saying that yes, there is an enriched elite, but that elite doesn't have any kind of constraint over Putin. It puts an interesting question. I mean, it's sort of the two things together, I think, are kind of an interesting picture of the situation, and all of which I think loops back into the sort of question of this panel, which is kind of like what comes next. If you've made yourself this kind of indispensable center who can be popular even though economic conditions have stagnated or even gotten worse, who can have the elites around him who he has enriched, which seems to be a good way to prevent, you know, worrying too much about the masses, but even those people can be targeted and hurt without it coming back to you. Like, where does that leave us going forward? I don't know. It's just throwing that out there as an observation. I'll let Kim, and then I'm going to...
Okay, I would defer to Henry on this because he really, I mean, he does the best work on sort of the informal politics and where the circles are and the patronal regime of Putin that I think anybody has done. So he can feel free to disagree with me. I think that there is an inner circle around Putin that is indispensable to Putin. And it's probably people who have information about him that he doesn't want to have get out. And so I don't think it's that they're all indispensable, but the ones that are indispensable don't have any ties to the West. And so we have no way of actually targeting them with sanctions that are in any way meaningful. We put sanctions on Friday on Patrushev, I think. Wasn't Patrushev sanctioned on Friday? Like Patrushev has investments in the United States. So.
All right.
I want to just push back a little bit on, respectfully, on a couple of things that maybe I think are a little bit overstated. I think somebody wrote a book called Imagined Economies. I find myself in the funny position of saying that the economy matters here. But I think there is a limit to how much economic decline the regime can sustain and still have high levels of popular support. People are still better off than they were in the 90s. It's still very important to have the trope of the 90s as this terrible, terrible time. But I don't know. Maybe it's not going to be tomorrow. But I think that that is a constraint on their power, the limited economic growth that they're likely to see. So they'll have to. Maybe they can get everybody to love him, and so it doesn't matter that the economy isn't doing well. But I think that that is a constraint. But going back a little bit to something that Kim said, if the sanctions aren't taking away people's money, they're making it difficult for them to do things that they like to do, like travel, or use credit cards, or live like normal European rich people. So that, I think, has an effect on oligarchs, even if it doesn't necessarily make them poor. But also, it's not that the sanctions break a tie between Putin and an oligarch. It imposes a cost on an oligarch, and we might think the oligarch would then say, like, hey, perhaps we should reconsider what we're doing. However, I don't think, one, if I could disagree a tiny bit with Kim, I see zero probability of Putin embracing the West in any way. I think he's so tied to that. So I don't really see.
He say he was going to embrace the West.
Even a little bit, coming to like, look, I've worked things out with him. I think the anti-Western rhetoric, the anti-European rhetoric is really necessary for him. Although he's constrained in that way too, because with the rise of the right in Europe, it's harder to say there's this rampant liberalism in European countries the more right-wing governments come to power. And the attack on Skripal, one of the great gifts that Trump gave Putin was the break between the United States and Europe. Like, who could have imagined such a gift, to have some distance between the US and Europe, the US and NATO? And it looked like that was just this amazing thing for Putin. But the Skripal thing, I think, has reduced that gap significantly. So I think the sanctions are making it difficult for some oligarchs, but it's not necessarily turning them against Putin. And then just one final thing is that a lot of the oligarchs or people around Putin, I think if you look into their personal situation, they're much more global and complicated than it may seem. So if you see Putin, I happen to have a small side project on hockey diplomacy, and if you look at Putin's team and who are two of the people on his team that he plays with multiple times per week, it's Oleg and Igor Budman. And Igor Budman is a very famous saxophonist. Maybe people have heard of him.
I've heard him perform in New York.
Well, if you look him up on Wikipedia, he's Bill Clinton's favorite saxophonist. He's also an American citizen because he went to Berklee School of Music, and his first wife was Donna Griesenbeck from the Davis Center's college roommate. And I mean, there's a lot of connections there, but he travels to the US all the time. He's an American citizen. His brother is in New York all the time. He's a drummer. But in addition to being...
He's in the hockey team, or he's in his band?
Both.
Oh.
So this is, I worked on race and jazz in Russia, which led me to this strange realization that a number of prominent jazz musicians in Russia play hockey, and they play on Putin's team.
This is so interesting.
It's very interesting. And actually, the whole KHL, if you look at the board of the KHL, I don't know, at this point, probably 3/4 of them are on the sanctions list, the Continental Hockey League. That Continental Hockey League is started by Gazprom Export, and it's very tied to the oil gas firms. Anyways, my point was that you look at somebody like Igor Budman, and you might say, well, this guy performs at Putin's house, he's close to him, he plays hockey with him every week, but he's also an American citizen. So I think that these ties are more complicated than just some gray figure in the security services or just some anti-American type. These are people with a lot of overlapping ties, property, etc.
Okay, let's turn it open for the people in the audience to ask some questions. So, yeah, Steve.
I have one domestic, one foreign one, and I'll try and keep them quick. The domestic one sort of gets at Josh, your comment on sort of Graham's observation that I think one of the most interesting things here is the disconnect between economic performance and popularity, right? That Putin is genuinely popular. And so I'm trying to play that out now 6 years, right? If the economy continues to slide, and if you look at the sort of popularity trends in the past, you're almost certain to see an erosion of that, right? So what then happens? And I'm wondering what, Graham, you or any of the panelists think of the theory that Yasha Monk is pushing in his latest book, which is, to paraphrase, Russia has sort of plateaued, so the best thing that they can do is bring everyone else down so that as their kind of gradual erosion, as their plateau sort of slips, they're still doing better than everyone else. So the rise of the right that you always talk about in Europe is really more than just a rise of the right. It's a complete discrediting of the whole democratic enterprise. And so it equips the Russians to say, whatever, it's still better than the kasha that's going on out there. A very quick foreign policy one is, to Kim, if you're putting hope in arms control, some kind of arms control theory to reopen lines of communication, what does Bolton mean for that?
Oh, jeez.
All right, do you answer that
Disastrous.
question?
So can I just quickly say on Bolton, he's responsible for the U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the ABM treaty. He has no interest in it.
So on this question about is Russia trying to bring us down to their level, and so that we can say, oh, well, they're terrible too. I just think like our problems are our problems. That this desire that we have to find somebody to blame for the mess that we've made is understandable, but it's misguided. And so if you think about the trouble, we've been spent the last 15 minutes talking about the trouble that we have messing with their regime type. Like their odds of messing with our regime type are really, 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 even more limited. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think there's much to that. It doesn't hurt them, but I don't think they're playing much of an effective role in that. I think this question about play out stagnant economic performance for 6 more years, what does that look like, is really, really interesting. When does that start to erode? I agree with you, there is a limit, right? There must be some kind of limit to which the economy can't stagnate and living standards become less than people around them without that affecting popularity. Unless you think about Cuba, in which case there is no limit to which you can get poorer and poorer and poorer and maintain support for the regime, or at least some kind of elements of support for the regime. So I think that to me is the big question. What we've clearly seen, I think, is a change in the basis of politics, away from the economy to more emotional and psychologically based mechanisms. How long that will last, I think, is really, really hard to say. Well, everyone has been telling me for the last 3 or 4 years that the Crimea moment is over, and it's over, and it's still over, and it's not over. And I think the election suggested that it's not over. And so, if you think about where the decline in these kinds of rally around the flag effects comes from in democracies, it comes from criticism of the regime from within. Some other actors and the opposition start to criticize how the regime's handling the process, and there is no mechanism for that in Russian politics as it currently stands. So I think it's quite possible that play it out 6 years, and we could still be playing the same game.
Sergey?
Yeah, so I have a sort of question and comment on this question of what comes next, specifically about this hypothesis of some constitutional reform in Russia that goes to parliamentary republic or some separation of power. So I see at least 2 reasons, each one sufficient, that suggest that it won't happen. One is, where is the evidence that Putin believes in separation of powers and diluting power somehow anywhere, much less in Russia? Even when he was part of power sharing agreement with Medvedev, he feared this arrangement and he believed it was a cause of instability and ultimately ended. And separately from that, how can Putin be sure that whoever comes on top in this power struggle after him, that somebody who is not picked by him specifically would not turn, if not for any genuine disagreement, but just for, let's say, punishing Putin and getting some sanctions lifted or something like that. Remember even after Stalin's death, not the strongest guy came on top. So it's hard to predict in these situations who will win. And so my conclusion from that is that either Putin stays or he will have to find his own Putin. And this, by the way, creates some sort of intrigue, I think, here. Because Putin knows that he will not have any say in terms of preserving, maintaining his political policy legacy. The only thing that he can hope for, this is what Putin did with Yeltsin's legacy. He didn't preserve it. The only thing that Putin could hope for is that he will have some ironclad commitments that him personally and his family are protected. But that is mostly it. So maybe the question to Henry, who suggested this possibility, where do you see the evidence that Putin is contemplating such an arrangement after he leaves office?
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think the evidence is just in how he rules the people under him, which is, I mean, he's not diluting his own power, but at the same time, I mean, he practices divide and rule regularly, right? Kind of pitting these different clans among each other. When one gets a little too strong, you know, he weakens the other one. I mean, the succession issue was in 2007 was kind of an exact practice of that, right? You had one kind of classic Silovik versus sort of your Western liberal Medvedev, and one would get a little ahead in the polls, and you could see a little more coverage for the other in the media. So I think he's well practiced in the art of balancing. And so his task would be, and I agree it's a challenge, would be to somehow extract himself from that, so that he could kind of play the role of making sure that nobody wins. And it's because I don't think he can trust anyone else. I mean, he was able to trust Medvedev to some degree, partly because he was weak. But I think that also seemed to be generating dissatisfaction within certain other parts of the elite who didn't really like what Medvedev was doing, and I think he wasn't completely satisfied either. So I think it would be very risky for him, and I think he understands it, to let anybody else kind of fully take over. So kind of the idea that I would have for it, again, I'm not saying it's like particularly likely any more than any of the other scenarios, but the logic behind it would be, kind of to do what Ivanishvili did, which was, you basically shifted power to parliament, have a prime minister that is beholden to a very diverse set of fractions in the parliament. So no one fraction dominates it. I mean, there are lots of different kind of elite networks in there. So the prime minister never becomes kind of all powerful either. You have a presidency that has some power and is in rivalry with the prime minister. And then he himself still controls like lots of assets and material wealth that he can mobilize when needed, and maintaining kind of his authority as kind of father of the nation, who in Georgia's case, who kind of saved the nation from the scourge of Saakashvili, right, to kind of come out and weigh in at key moments to kind of keep people balanced. So that would be the logic, I mean, if I were him, that would be where I would be thinking of doing if I were going to try to leave power. But I agree, the logic very well may lead him not to be able to escape it, and probably that's the more probable outcome, but still he can't escape it in the end, because what if he becomes somehow incapacitated or cares about his friends and in-laws and wants to protect their assets? If he just dies and says, well, to hell with them after I die, okay, maybe he thinks that way, but he seems to be a fairly loyal guy, so I bet he's at least thinking about these things. So that would be the logic behind it.
I actually don't think, though, that if we dive into the emotional, psychological side of things, I don't think Putin is indifferent to what happens to Russia in the future or after his regime. He's interested in a strong Russia. He's interested in a Russia that stands up to the United States. So while the fragmented political state could work, I agree with you, like same with Mexico or something, you could imagine a way in which you're in power and you want everybody to be weak after you. I don't really see why would he want to do that. And Medvedev, I personally think the 2008, the decision decision to take himself out of the presidency, put himself in the prime minister, and replace somebody else as president is unbelievably risky. And there was a lot of speculation of, oh, what must Medvedev have on Putin, etc. What Medvedev had was a core constitution that made him unable to stand up to anyone, including Putin. I mean, Putin, I don't know, did he hire psychological experts to say, find me a bureaucrat here that is the weakest-willed human being in the whole Moscow, and this is who we'll put in place. I mean, I don't think it was a quid pro quo money. Medvedev had something on him. I think Medvedev was just that way. And Putin was right that he couldn't stand up to him, including the final humiliation in the end, where he didn't allow him to have the second term. So I don't know. I think that it is a conundrum that Putin has interest in Russia being a strong state and Russia having a strong role in the world. And who is going to do that beside him? And he's said the message so long, there's nobody but Putin. I think he believes it.
Okay.
Just very briefly, something to think about is that Putin and Xi Jinping have an incredibly strong and friendly relationship. If I were Putin and I knew it was time to retire, I'd move to China. I'm quite serious.
Yeah, Henry. Yeah, I just wanted to actually, Yoi's remarks reminded me of kind of the last point which I wanted to make. I'd actually planned to say it, but was running out of time in the introductory remarks, which is, I mean, I think kind of the ceiling part of this arrangement would be that it would be a kind of collegial rule, right? That it would be some kind of, attempt to forge some kind of consensus around the idea of sort of Russia's greatness and instilling in them the idea that, you rock the boat, you're rocking the future for all of us, and for a long time he'll be kind of in the back, sort of a Edward Kennan-esque type vision or Brezhnev era type thing. So that would be how I would think he would, if he were thinking about that, would try to kind of encapsulate this idea of sort of or kind of seal this idea of a collective leadership. To the extent that the elites are kind of reacting emotively or with some kind of patriotic rallying to what's going on, that could help seal it.
Didn't work out for Beria though.
Yeah.
So first of all, thanks to all the panelists for really interesting and insightful talks. You covered like a range of issues, both domestic and foreign policy. So I have two questions for both areas. So in terms of the foreign policy, imagine Putin stays in power, like whenever it's going to be 2024, right? So would the United States respond somehow to that? Like, imagine he doesn't change the constitution or does change the constitution. Would the US respond to that? And if so, then how would the United States respond to that? And the domestic policy question. So at the moment, the regime has enough support in Duma to change the constitution in any possible way, but we don't know what's going to be the outcome of the next parliamentary election, right? So there is some uncertainty about that. So do you think Putin will keep uncertainty until the very end and not implement any reforms before the next parliamentary election? Or do you think we should be expecting some moves with the current Duma in power? Thanks.
On the US part, we know the answer to that. Xi Jinping got rid of term limits, and our president tweeted him a congratulations. So I think that if Putin, under the Trump administration, were to get rid of all term limits, he may well get a congratulatory tweet as well.
We hope that Trump is not still in office in 2024.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, yeah.
That's a pessimistic view.
Yeah, but I think the possibility of any U.S. Other than the best you could hope for is some people of stature in the United States of America expressing some sadness about a further decline of democracy. But if you look at Alex Jones or Breitbart yesterday, what were they playing? They were playing Ron Paul, the father of Rand Paul, video saying that the Syrian chemical weapons attack was a false flag attack and that it was done by, I don't know who, liberals or something, Hillary Clinton, in order to draw I don't remember who did it, but it was not done by Assad. It was done in order to draw the United States into Syria. And that's what that's where we are in America in terms of consistent messaging and support. It's not just the Russians denying that it was a chemical weapons attack, but even prominent people in the United States denying that. So, yeah, I think the hope that the U.S. will play any role in that, I think, is low, very low.
I also think that uncertainty around the Duma elections is pretty low as well. I mean, it depends. So the big question is, and I think Henry raised this, is whether the Duma elections are going to take place on schedule or not. If they take place on schedule, then I would anticipate that the sensible thing to happen is that they basically want a rerun of the last Duma elections, and this kind of keeps it keeps stability and it keeps things on ice for right to the end of the second term of this term. I don't see any reason to suspect that Putin wants to be precipitous into provoking some kind of real contest in those elections. I think that would be very dangerous and very, to my mind, very unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, in general, I mean, I agree with the logic. I kind of think if they're going to change the Constitution in some way, it'll probably happen before 2021, just because that brings risks. And, I think that would be kind of where some of the elite jockeying for position might kind of have an influence, right? Because, it might not mean the formation of an opposition party led by Sechin or something like that. But, what it might be is some groups kind of, tacitly trying to undermine United Russia and kind of prevent it from getting a constitutional majority without maybe support from certain deputies that they might support, right? Like these rumors of Chemizov supporting Grudinin. All these kinds of things can kind of come into play then. So, it makes sense to kind of go ahead and do it now. In 2008, the constitutional amendment to lengthen the terms, right? They came at the beginning of Medvedev's term, not towards the end. So I think it kind of makes sense to do it while, given all the uncertainties a lot of us have talked about, to do it now. So that would be something that I would look for. Doesn't mean they won't change their mind if they let it go and do it, but I think that, if you're going to do it, now's the safest time if you're planning it.
So none of you in this discussion do see the scenario possibility of Putin being actually overthrown. I mean, statistically, 50% of dictators do get overthrown. Like, ex post it looks inevitable, ex ante it looks impossible, right? But all of this discussion sort of assumes that just, continuity is just a matter of fact. How exactly is this going to be done? So that possibility is completely off the table.
I wouldn't say it's off the table. I think that I would say there is support now, but it is fragile because, as you said, one, it doesn't look realistic today, but something could change that made Navalny or somebody else appear as a realistic alternative, and I think the support for Putin would evaporate very quickly. But people are experienced with disappointment and revolution from the 90s and into the 2000s. So I think that this is not a naive populace that says, like, all you have to do is go out and shout for something good and something good will happen. It's people that had so many hopes that were dashed by participation, and they already experienced a very difficult regime change that they thought would lead to something, and it didn't lead to that. So I think there's a kind of, even some of the toughest opposition people, like, or even crazy, like Yevgeny Albat, would say, oh, I don't want to live through a revolution again, So they dislike the regime intensely, but they're kind of waiting. They're waiting for the right opportunity. So I think that I wouldn't rule out that there could be a revolution. It's just that people are not going to naively jump in front of the police who are arresting them. They're just considering, what's it going to be? How is it going to work out? I think there's more patience there to wait for the right moment. But I think if it did come, it could come very quickly. Maybe that's unsatisfactory.
I think if there was a black swan event, if there was something that caused the Russian economy to absolutely tank in a way that was not recoverable, or if Putin insisted on staying on the job after he had become mentally incompetent and there was no way to get him to leave voluntarily, I think we should not completely eliminate the possibility of some kind of internal coup. I don't think it would be a military coup institutionally, but I wouldn't be surprised, I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility of the kind of coup attempt against Gorbachev, with a group of elites who have power over sources of information and power over some form of armed forces, whether or not it's the military, deciding that enough is enough. But there's nothing on the horizon that looks like that will happen.
Henry? Yeah, I'll just briefly say, maybe going back to what Graham says, I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by overthrown. Because I think that for a lot of reasons Graham talked about, kind of the main threats, even the ones involving kind of elite defections, would have to play out somehow through elections. In order to be to take place. And the only actors that may be capable of really carrying off an actual coup, I just don't see it happening in terms of like just masses in the street, literally driving them out of office outside of an electoral, unless you just had something absolutely catastrophic happen. He's televised on, live doing something, like losing his mind or something, but, which you don't see happening. But the Siloviki, right, these groups, I mean, they're very divided, right, and he's been very careful to kind of keep them divided institutionally and informally in terms of the networks. And so it's hard to see that any one of them could really hope to do it. It would just take an extraordinary amount of coordination among their part, and unity, which doesn't seem likely. So, you can never rule anything out in Russia, but Historically, Russia just hasn't really had successful coups, and so Brian Taylor would kind of point to political culture of these kind of armed services as well. But I think there are a number of reasons also involving just the divisions within the Siloviki.
I think one thing, just to push a little bit back on Yoi's point, which is of course very well taken, that everybody lived through this and there's the experience of the 1990s. But it's important to remember anytime we talk about these things, there is a generation right now of Russians who didn't live through the 1990s. And the generation who lived through the 1990s and had the worst experience in the 1990s is dying off. Right? So over time, even, I mean, everyone on this panel cut our teeth on the Soviet politics in the 1990s, so we of course remember it and everything like that. But like, and the people who tend to take to the streets, I mean, we can get into this more about the thing, but like, who cause trouble when they're on the streets tend to be younger people. And so I do think this message, it was interesting last March with the message of the switch to corruption, right? And the combination, and again, this is kind of why I found Graham's statement provocative, that like, we're in a post-economic, economic determinants of support for the regime error. I appreciated he said it started after 2000, after my first book finished. But when I talk about this, but about the economy, going back to previous books, but I do think this idea that there is a generation of people who didn't live through the 1990s, and so then the deal of no, we get to keep a certain portion of the wealth because we provide stability, because without that, you go back to the 1990s, there's a portion of the population who I just don't think that resonates with as much. And again, like all these legacy effects, the question is it being transmitted generationally? But there's no real model where we think that even if there is generational transmission, it's not being weakened as it's transmitted generationally. So I think we'll watch that over time, and I think it's an interesting question. And I think that, again, and I'll echo, I think sort of the brilliance of Navalny is corruption corruption, it's easy to be against corruption. It's easy to be against people stealing stuff. And I think those things do resonate with depending on how difficult economic life is. And, and I continue to be, I mean, to go back to Graham's thing, as what, you said, everyone's been saying, oh, the Crimea bump is ending, the Crimea bump is ending. I mean, what I've said in these conversations is I'm puzzled by why the Crimea bump hasn't ended. I continue to think that's an interesting puzzle. And maybe part of the answer is this, and we've had these conversations in other fora like this, but maybe part of the answer is the Crimea bump not ending because this inability to conceive of an alternative to Putin? And if that's the particular case, then I think this really comes down to the Grahams, do they really love me? Or is it just this inability to conceive of an alternative? Because if it's the inability to conceive of an alternative, it does lead to the possibility, as you're always saying, that it's a kind of thin support. And this is always the question. And thin support, as Artur said, like, it's very easy ex post to explain the support was thin. It's harder to see it ex ante when it comes in there. I'll give you the last few.
I mean, thin support, thick support, I don't think we know that's not a thing until ex post, right? And so I'm not sure that that's a really useful way to think about it. But I do think if one is, I think it would be a very rare, very kind of black swan type event for there to be removal of Putin from pressure from the outside. But we know that black swan events happen. And I think the key group to look at is young people, is the youth. I think that what Putin was very good at up until sort of 2012 and was to turn his biggest supporter was in that demographic. And those people are now in their mid-20s and on, and the question is, what about the next group of young people? And there's some straws in the wind that suggest that he's losing his ability to charm those kids. And so that, I think, is something really interesting. I don't think we have any good data on this yet, but if I had money to do surveys, I'd do a lot of work in that demographic. I think that would be really interesting. And I think the role of what happens in Ukraine is really, really important in this regard. In the, I'm afraid, highly unlikely event that the Ukrainian reforms and revolution number 2 is a success, or revolution number 3 is a success, that would be very dramatic. And it would have a huge impact upon this particular cohort. I think the way that looks, very, the situation in Ukraine is very poor, I think, and looking to get worse rather than better. But that, I think, is also a key place to be looking at if you're looking for sources of revolution.
It's amazing how fast 2 hours has gone by. Before we close, do any of the other panelists want to make a last comment at this point? All right, well then please join me in thanking them for a really stimulating, really interesting